Broken Arrow or WARNO? Which is the better wargame, and which should you put your money and time into? That was a question I saw asked a lot during the last round of Steam sales on both WARNO and Broken Arrow's forums. And since I play both Broken Arrow and WARNO, along with having played every single wargame Eugene Systems has ever released, all the way back to Ruse, well, I fancy that I'm in a pretty good position to answer that particular question. So, WARNO versus Wargame. Which one is best? That is a complicated question for a complicated pair of games. Both WARNO and Broken Arrow are high-level wargames, and they are chock full of mechanics and systems that place their complexity well above that of the average real-time strategy game. The two titles also have a lot of similarities, as a large part of the reason why Broken Arrow was created was due to dissatisfaction of the Wargame series, the predecessor to WARNO. And so, to help us figure this one out, we are going to divide this into several categories: deck building, gameplay, which will be subdivided into infantry, armored, air, and artillery, ease of learning, DLC and long-term support, modding. And finally, a category that is both incredibly important, but also, mind you, very ephemeral and can change at any time: matchmaking. Without further ado then, let's get started with deck building. Which might seem like a strange place to start instead of gameplay, but, well, the gameplay is determined by the decks you create, and building a deck is a fundamental part of the charm of these wargames. Plus, you're probably going to be spending as much time in the deck builder as in the actual game anyway, so its quality is of paramount importance. Welcome to WARNO's Deck Builder. Both video games have, of course, deck building mechanics, where you select a division or a nation or specializations and then choose between a variety of units unique to that selection that you will then bring onto the battlefield in order to emerge victorious and defeat your foes. A great deal of the game's most interesting mechanics revolves around selecting the correct army for the correct scenario, and to selecting the correct units to counter anything that the enemy might bring against you, as the enemy too, of course, will have access to just as many toys as you do, and with a plethora of decks to choose between, you've got to either go all in on a gimmick or try to build a deck that can face any situation. And indeed, one of the most satisfying things about both games, in my opinion, is fighting a battle and then going back and tweaking your deck so that it can face down those circumstances a little bit better the next time around. The two systems do share a fair few similarities, but there are also a lot of differences, which I'll do my best to point out as we cover the deck builder. As you begin with WARNO, you select a battle group or a division from a list of ready-made divisions you can see here. There are quite a few in the base game, and more are added quite frequently via DLC. The divisions have some different specializations like armored, airborne, mechanized, and so on. Let's take, for example, the classic 3rd Armored Division. Once you have selected a division, you are then given a series of tabs that you can fill: logistic, infantry, artillery, tank, recon, anti-air, helicopters, and air. The number of these tabs and the cost within them are dependent upon your regiment. For example, the 3rd Armored Division is not going to have a massive amount of infantry, and so it has a somewhat more limited numbers of infantry openings, and they cost a lot more, as you have 50 activation points. If I select, for example, this unit card right here, that will take up 1 activation point. As you can see, 1 activation point, another, and the next slot then costs 2 activation points. You need to create a deck that can meet your needs within the limits of the activation points, but the costs of the unit you don't need to worry about. So that's right here is the unit cost. This is how much it costs to summon the unit into battle on the battle map. So the Hemet supply truck costs 60 points, whereas the M1A1 Abrams cost 275 points. Now you also have an availability metric here. So you can see this number indicates that if I pick this card, I have selected 4 M1A1 Abrams. This is one of the largest differences from Broken Arrow and WARNO. In Broken Arrow, once you've purchased a card, you can summon as many units as you want from that card, though they do have a maximum number on the field, and they do have a cooldown so that you can't destroy a unit and instantly recall it. In WARNO, however, you have a number of cards that you can select. In this case, this number down here, 6. So I can select 6 cards of M1A1 Abrams. And the number 4 can be further adjusted via the Veterancy tab, which is a feature that Broken Arrow does not have. At green veterancy, the unit has no particular bonuses, and this is its stat card. If I, however, pick veterancy trained, you will notice that the weapon's accuracy, both stationary and in motion, has now increased, along with various other statistics. And if you hover over the chevrons, you will be given a breakdown of exactly what the veterancy does. Now, if you select a higher veterancy, you will see that the number of units on the card decreases. So I can either have 1 card of 4 green Abrams, a card of 2 trained Abrams, or a card of a single veteran Abrams. There are also units in WARNO called Commanders. The Commanders have this little icon here. The Commanders have an area of effect around them, which is the leadership bubble. Within that bubble, all units are increased by 1 level of veterancy. So I could, for example, bring the 2 M1A1 Abrams at trained veterancy. And so long as they are near the command vehicle, they will operate with the same stats as a veteran vehicle. This is a feature that Broken Arrow also does not have. You may also have noticed that in addition to the stats panel, various units and weapons also have numbers of special little abilities attached to them as well, along with a classification. For example, this obviously is a mortar. Mortars are crew-served indirect fire weapons. While capable of engaging targets rapidly, mortars do not have a great range and lack accuracy. A quick description of what the weapon is. In this case, the 107mm mortar does a 1.18 points of HE damage and 160 points of suppression. This, of course, is damage, and this is suppression to the squad. A squad that begins to panic, having its morale broken, becomes significantly less effective. Then you have the target range, 5,625 meters, followed by a rate of fire, aiming time, how long it takes the weapon to aim and get ready to fire, the reload time, 10 seconds, and the salvo length, the number of shots fired during one barrage, and then the supply cost, which is how much it costs to replenish the weapon's ammunition in full. This is important because the Hemet supply vehicles carry a certain amount of supply, 2,000, as you can see right there. Let's get into building a deck then, shall we? And we'll talk about the specific requirements as we do so. What you want to do first, in most cases, is bring a field supply point. This is a forward operating base that has a large amount of supply. Now, it is quite expensive, but normally I find that the additional supplies are very useful, and this is another difference between the two. In this game, if I buy 3 Hemets, that's all the Hemets I have, a total of 6,000 supply. If these Hemets are lost, or if I throw them away or anything, I can't call in any more. So if I only bring 3 Hemets, I only have 6,000 supplies. But the Hemets can reload their supplies from the forward operations base. Meanwhile, in Broken Arrow, once you call in a logistics vehicle and empty it, you can then retreat the logistics vehicle. And once a short cooldown is over, you can call in another one. So in WARNO, the logistics is on map, but as in Broken Arrow, the logistics is off map. After we've got some supply trucks, some smaller ones for flexibility and some large ones, we then need a command vehicle. Command vehicles are very important, as we will touch upon in the gameplay section of the video, because without them you cannot capture zones. Command vehicles come in many flavors, from armored APCs to unarmored swift jeeps and even helicopters. With the advantages being that an armored platform is significantly tougher with its armor, less likely to be destroyed by artillery, whilst the smaller ones are often significantly faster, and the helicopters of course are the fastest of all, but can be spotted from a very long distance. Then we've got the artillery, so let's have a look at the stats breakdowns of the weapons. This will be important for later later comparison with Broken Arrow. You've got support weapons like the 50 cal, then you've got things specialized like the engineers, which have a flash incendiary launcher, which will do nothing to tanks. As you can see, it has no armor piercing value, but it has incendiary special ability, napalm, which is very good at infantry and at panicking them. A standard fire team, as you can see here, has a series of weaponry. In WARNO, the number of weapons is 4 max. In this case, they carry assault rifles. They have 4 M16A2s. They have 1 M249 light support weapon, as you can see indicated by the number after the weapon's name, 1 M60 medium machine gun, and 1 AT4 anti-tank rocket, with this number here, 920 for the M249, being the ammunition carried in the weapon. The weapons then have individual stats that are also affected by the unit's veterancy, by doing things like increasing the accuracy of the weapon, for example, its rate of fire, and also its aiming time. A higher veterancy squad will also have a higher stress recovery and stress resistance. This is in relevance to being suppressed. For example, a green squad will be suppressed far more quickly than a veteran squad, and as the squad is suppressed, they lose a huge portion of their accuracy, up to 50%. So a suppressed squad can be rendered, in essence, utterly helpless. There are also going to be a variety of weapon types. The AT4, for example, is a short-range anti-tank launcher, whereas the Dragoon is a medium-range anti-tank guided missile. As you can see here, manual guidance, which also, by the way, means that if the squad is panicking, it's not going to be very good at guiding that missile onto target. Generally speaking, you are going to want a good number of nice little fire support squads like these with AT4s for close-in work, along with some things like the Tau 2, for example, an anti-tank guided missile with long range and high accuracy. This is another key difference between WARNO and Broken Arrow. In WARNO, ATGMs have a percentage hit chance, so this is a 70% chance to hit. So the weapon can miss, whereas in Broken Arrow, guided missiles always hit, unless they are actively interfered with by something like smoke, or the target moving out of view, or the target having an active protection system capable of shooting down the guided missile. This has benefits and advantages. Personally, I am definitely on the Broken Arrow side, as I've always felt that anti-tank guided missiles in WARNO are simply too unpredictable, particularly as their accuracy is affected by their panic rating, meaning that if you start shooting at this anti-tank missile launcher, its 70% accuracy will fall to something along the lines of 30%, and only carrying 6 weapons, that's pretty bad. You're also usually going to want something to deal with infantry, like for example the engineer squad here with their satchel charges, simply just big old bombs, or things like recoilless rifles. Now, military police also have some special abilities like military police, grant suppression regeneration bonus to nearby allies and remove any reserve traits from them. So, if you are in a situation where you expect your troops to be suppressed a lot, having a military police patrol nearby will help you get through that. You will also notice that you have to select a escorting vehicle, like the Bradley IFVs here, for example, or a Humvee. In WARNO, you must select a transport. That transport is then tied to the unit for all eternity, and it can only be called in that transport. In Broken Arrow, you may select a transport, but you can select any transport capable of carrying troops in your deck to put units on the field. Of course, one of the big strengths of the armored deck is access to things like the Bradley, which is an excellent little IFV. Then we've got some artillery. One of the very cool aspects of WARNO is a automation system for artillery, which we'll probably touch upon in the gameplay section. You've got good old-fashioned tube artillery, you've got mortars, and you've got multiple launch rocket batteries too. These largely come with the variation being cluster, which explode high above, shoving the ground underneath with anti-vehicle weaponry, or good old-fashioned high explosives, or also having access to things like smoke, for example, to cover the advance of friendly units. You're always going to want to have some artillery, even if it is just infantry artillery like mortars, or in this case an APC mounted variant, to suppress enemy units and to utilize cover like smoke. Then you've got the tanks. The tanks, of course, are going to be the queens of any real armored deck, and their main stat is probably the armor, with a stat value of 21, meaning that if something like, for example, this Abrams here shot at it with only 20 penetration, it is unlikely to do any serious damage. It might do nothing, or it might do just one tiny bit of damage to the vehicle, as the vehicles in this game have hit points. Now, the hit point system is a little bit wonky in that if a unit has taken sufficient damage, it can take critical hits, which can end up destroying a tank. So if you repair it endlessly, you do sort of reduce its durability, but this is one of those kind of little weird things that's going around. As you can see here, the max damage indicates the max damage the unit is capable of withstanding, 10, so that is the rough equivalent of hit points in this case. The higher your penetration is compared to the enemy's armor, the more damage you do. In this case, we have the excellent penetration of the M1A1HA, but we only got 2 of them, so we're going to bring them in decks of 2, and we're going to support them with a leader unit, which, I mean, you could take the more expensive option, and in this case, as we sacrifice a fair bit of front armor, it seems like a decent thing to do. Loads and loads of those beautiful things, and some tow launchers, with as high veterancy as we can get for that sweet, sweet accuracy bonus. And then some more middling Abrams for meat. The reconnaissance tab is always important, as this is where we get to the optics and stealth attributes. Optics determines how good your unit is at seeing the enemy. It goes from very bad to excellent, with, for example, the Kiowa having exceptional optics. This indicates some form of radar, as you can see here on the Kiowa. These units are capable of spotting enemy units at the highest rate possible. And the stealth means that they are very difficult to actually spot in return. So, seeing as information is everything in games like these, you do want a good number of very high optic units that are very difficult to spot. Generally speaking, infantry like snipers are very difficult to detect, but does not have quite the detection radius of something like a radar-equipped Kiowa, for example. 9 times out of 10, though, infantry are the way to go, although Kiowas being able to see over cover and things like that is also pretty damn nice. You might also on occasion have something a little bit more fighty in recon squads that can do more of a combat duty, but not so much here. And we are going to bring a nice couple of Bradleys along as well to come along with our tanks as combat spotters. Anti-air is of course always important to help deal with enemy aircraft, where they will have 2 stats, helicopter and aircraft. As obviously aircrafts fly a hell of a lot higher than a helicopter, it makes sense to differentiate between the two. Certain weapon systems may be specifically designed to deal with one or the other. The Chaparral, for example, has a 3.5 kilometer range against aircraft, making it excellent at dealing with them, whereas the Humboldt Stinger, whilst being very good at dealing with cavalry, as I would say, helicopters, it has a reduced range against aircraft, due largely to the smaller weapon. In this case, some Chaparrals, you can never go wrong, but you always want a little bit of ground-based man-pads too. Helicopters, usually these are rapid reaction forces. Unfortunately, in WARNO, helicopters are not implemented extremely well in my opinion, as they have a nasty habit of moving far too much and needing to stay stationary to actually fire their weapons. So they are rather situational, something like an anti-tank variant with assloads of Hellfires, or something more of an anti-infantry persuasion with several batteries of unguided rockets. And then the air type. Here you have yet again quite a few variations, from anti-air vehicles like the F-15C Eagle with its anti-air AMRAAMs to things like seed vehicles like the Wild Weasel carrying seed missiles. Seed missiles are rather interesting because they usually have a very long range, but they can only target things with an active radar system. This is usually found on AA systems. Now, in the case of the Chaparral, it has a fire and forget system and does not have radar. The Pivot doesn't have either, but there is a version of the Pivot that does have radar, which will be indicated by a small icon here. If it has radar, then the seed missile will lock onto the target from its maximum range and home in against it, making it quite effective for, well, suppressing enemy air defenses. Then you've got things like bombers, like strike bombers with cluster bombs against tank, napalm to burn, or simply just good old-fashioned dumbfire bombs to dump upon your enemy. In this case, some F-15 Eagles will never be wrong, a little bit of seed as well, and a nice big fat F-111 with a belly full of high explosives. And that is a nice little generic deck for you right there, with 1 point to spare, which we might fill with a helicopter. Right. Why not bring in another anti-tank Apache? And that is how the deck building system works in WARNO. It's fairly easy to learn, it's fairly self-explanatory. The veterancy system is quite nice, though the limited cards has advantages and disadvantages. We'll touch upon that in the Broken Arrow deck builder segment. Welcome to Broken Arrow's deck builder. Immediately, you may notice that you do not have loads and loads of nations here, nor do you have dozens of different divisions to choose from. You have 2 countries, Russia and the United States, and each one of these has 5 different specializations, of which you can choose a combination of any 2 to create your deck. This may initially seem as if you are far more restricted than with WARNO, but that is only partially true. WARNO does have a far greater variety in available decks, but the majority of those decks only have 2 or 3 unique units, and many of them only have, well, 1 or even no unique mechanics. There are some exceptions, like the 101st Airborne, for example, with their electronic warfare planes, but the majority of the time, WARNO's decks are 90% variants upon already existing decks and units, reshuffled and reorganized with a couple of unique units. Meanwhile, in Broken Arrow, each one of the specializations has a near completely unique loadout of units, with a few shared, but it's pretty much the exact opposite ratio. Whereas WARNO has 2 or 3 unique units, in the case of Broken Arrow, the specializations have 2 or 3 shared units, with the majority of the units being significantly different, and therefore the specializations are significantly different. Another difference as well is that here you do not have activation points in the same way. Instead, you have 10,000 points to spend to build your deck. Those 10,000 points are divided between a reconnaissance tab, an infantry, vehicle, support, helicopter, and aircraft tabs. And how much points you have in each is determined by the specializations you choose. For example, if I select Special Forces, I will have 1,250 points in my aircraft tab. If I choose the Airborne Infantry, I'll have 1,500, and if I choose Armor, I will have 0. This allows you to mix and match your specializations. For example, you can have a jack-of-all-trades deck by picking Special Forces and Armor, giving you great infantry and great tanks, but very little in the form of helicopters or aircraft. Or you can double down and go heavy air with Special Ops and airborne, or a little bit more of a mix with more light vehicles and a little bit of air like striker cavalry, for example. Let's simply pick ourselves a nice little universal deck here with Spec Ops and Armor. Once you've selected your 2 specializations, you are brought to the army building screen, where you have a number of boxes that you can fill with units. In this case, instead of activation points again, each unit has a point cost. This is the same point cost as bringing the unit into the game. So if I select the Cavalry Scout with an MO113A3 transport, you will see that I will have used 115 of my total 10,000 points. There is also another limit, which is for each tab. In this case, I have 2,250 points to use in the reconnaissance tab, but that is not all the points you have to spend, as each specialization can also go about 10% over the total cost until you hit orange letters. You can then keep adding until you eventually reach red. Red is the point at which the deck is no longer legal and you can't add any more units into it. So this gives you a little bit of flexibility in the exact numbers of units you wish to bring. The number of units you can bring are largely dependent on your specialization. So for example, armor, I can pick 4 M1A2 SEP 2 tanks. You can see here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that takes the cost of the tank at 250 points, 4 times up to 1,000 points. Unlike WARNO, however, I am not limited to just having these 4 tanks. I am limited in that I can only ever have 4 tanks at one time, however. So, if I've got these 4 M1A2s, if I have all 4 on the field simultaneously, I cannot call in a 5th M1A2. However, if one of my 4 tanks are destroyed, then after a cooldown period has passed, I can call in another tank. Meaning that unlike in WARNO, you cannot run out of units in Broken Arrow. This is a system that has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that it allows for a far more aggressive form of game, where even if you lose a key unit, it is not gone forever. Even if your fully upgraded V3 trophy A2 is destroyed, that does not mean that it is gone forever. It simply means that you're going to have to wait like 5 minutes for its cooldown to be over, and then you can call in another. Whereas if you lose your super heavy tank in WARNO, that is an enormous blow, which tends to lead to far more defensive gameplay because you cannot afford to lose those damn things. You really cannot. The disadvantage is that whilst in WARNO, killing a big and super important enemy tank is really important, it is less so in Broken Arrow. And for those of you who absolutely hate artillery spam, well, in WARNO, if you manage to snipe the enemy's artillery, it's dead, it's gone. In Broken Arrow, you've just bought yourself 10-20 minutes without getting rained on until they will be back again. And the same also goes for aircraft, as there are quite a few people out now who really love using loads and loads of air power. And again, unlike in WARNO, you can't kill them, they will return. You've also got, of course, the usual stat blocks, as we can see here. The stats are, in many ways, similar to those of WARNO. You've got a certain number of weapons, like, for example, 6 HK-416s and 3 Mark 46 support weapons, and also 3 grenade launchers and 3 shotguns, along with the flashbangs right here. These weapons have an armor-piercing ability, a damage, and an accuracy, along with a secondary stat tab that shows you what exactly they can shoot at. For example, infantry, vehicles, and aircraft, whereas the grenade launcher cannot shoot aircraft. Now, the shotgun can shoot aircraft, but with an effective range of 200 meters, it's not going to happen particularly often. Some weapons might also have special abilities, like the hand grenades, for example. The hand grenades are auto-loaders, which means that no matter how stressed your squad is, as this game does have suppression, just like WARNO, it will be fired regardless. You might also have some special abilities, like airdroppable, allowing these units to be dropped out of an aircraft. You have sprint, which is their ability to move faster for 10 seconds. And you've got smoke, which, as the name implies, is obviously smoke. Then you've got the base stats, which is health, armor, spotting, concealment, movement speed, and the total weight of the unit. You've also got an additional excellent ability in Broken Arrow, which is different loadouts. In WARNO, these two would have to be separate units, whereas here, you can select the loadout of your squad. Do you want your Delta Force to be a standoff unit? Well, now it's going to be carrying a load of marksmanship rifles, along with proper snipers and long-range medium machine guns, along with a Fletcher rocket pod. You want them close up and personal, right? We've got carbines, we've got shorter range light machine guns, we've got grenade launchers, and we've got shotguns. In many cases, this will also change the cost of the unit. Let's see if we can find an example here. For example, the Rangers. If they're carrying the Roars, they'll cost 70 points. If you give them the Carl Gustavs, they are going to cost 100 points. This is a really cool system, in my opinion, and it can absolutely change the roles of some units. For example, the Ranger Scouts. With the basic loadout, they are your regular spotters. With anti-material rifles, however, they become proper combat scouts that can engage light vehicles both with their AT-4 rocket launchers and the 50 cal sniper rifle. There's also a very nice touch with the spotting system in Broken Arrow. You can see the optics around right here. Ground range 2000, so that's their ability to spot other ground units. Against a unit like the M1A2, that means that the Rangers can spot the M1 at 2000 meters, because it has a stealth of 1. However, the Pararescues, let's just for the sake of argument say, they have a stealth of 2. Right, well, what is 2000 divided by 2? That's right, 1000. And that is the spotting range of the Ranger Snipers, as you simply take the optics and divide it by the stealth. Easy peasy. Obviously, things like terrain and buildings will increase a unit's stealth, making them more difficult to spot. You will also have a variety of transport vehicles, which is a particularly nice touch. Let's say, for example, that you don't like any of the infantry carriers for your mechanized engineers, alright? Simply take them on foot with no vehicle attached, which is also, of course, going to make them cheaper because you're not paying for a transport vehicle. Let's then say that you want to deploy your mechanized engineers via aircraft. Fantastic. Just grab a Chinook right here, which can carry 32 infantrymen. Since the squad size of the mechanized engineer is 6, you can easily carry all 4 squads simultaneously. Furthermore, you can use any transport vehicle you select. If I, for example, take the mechanized engineers in a Bradley here, the Bradley can carry 6 people, which means that if I want to transport my mechanized engineers in a Bradley, I can simply call them in and select a Bradley transport, and there you go. I can also bring, for example, the Silent Hawk, the stealth helicopter, in for my Delta Force, and those 3 Silent Hawks can then be used to transport any unit. Say, for example, I want to put my Ranger snipers in the enemy's back line, and I want the stealthy helicopter to do it. No problem, you can. This is a fantastic touch that is, in my opinion, vastly superior to WARNO's system of dedicated infantry transport, as it gives you so much more freedom. Not to mention, in Broken Arrow, you can even stuff your troops in the back of a goddamn transport aircraft and drop them directly down on the battlefield. In fact, you can even accompany that with some vehicles. I very much so doubt you can airlift any of the tanks. No. But there are vehicles, do I have an example here? I don't think I actually do, of vehicles that can actually be airlifted. They'll have a little icon here that indicates they can be carried via a transport aircraft. Ah, there we go. The RSO is air droppable. So there are things like the Marine deck, for example, that can dump a whole host of things, including light armored vehicle, via transport aircraft, and boy, is that cool. Is it a mechanic that is also frequently abused right now? God, yes, but it's still absolutely awesome, in my opinion. The customization of units also becomes very important when it comes to things like armor and artillery and aircraft. For example, if I wanted my M1A2 Seps here to be basic units, they're at a decent price with 2 charges of smoke grenades along with the weapon systems. You may also notice that they have 2 types of armor. For example, if I take the Tusk 3 armor package, you will see that my side armor stats increase. The white number is kinetic armor. That is the armor's ability to protect against kinetic weaponry, things like bullets and solid projectiles. The second number is its ability to protect against heat, high explosive anti-tank rounds. You will see the weapons as well. In this case, we have 2 types of ammunition. One is a kinetic round with 500 penetration, and one is a heat round with 400 penetration. Generally, heat tends to do more damage, making it far more effective at killing things quickly, but explosive reactive armor is very good at dealing with heat. I can also further upgrade my vehicle to have active protection systems. As I mentioned in the WARNO video, unlike WARNO in this game, anti-tank guided missiles and even things like the rocket launchers will trigger active defensive systems. So, if my rangers were going up against a step with the trophy system, the trophy would shoot down the rocket. Now, it'll shoot down 1 rocket, and then it's in a 6-second cooldown. This is also the reason why it is so important to have multiple launches. If I engage the tank with a trophy system with the rangers, they would fire 1 rouse at the enemy tank, which would be defeated by the active protection system. If I, however, bring in the Moors team here with the Carl Gustavs, they have 3 launchers. The tank can only shoot down 1 of those rockets, and so the other 2 will hit. Additionally, the active protection system will increase the cost of the vehicle significantly. I really enjoy this system, by the way, because it allows you to be far more aggressive with your armor. You no longer need to simply camp your heavy tanks in tree lines. It is absolutely a valid strategy to push up aggressively, tank incoming enemy fire, trusting in your active protection system and smoke to keep you safe, and then disengage. It makes tanks feel, well, more like tanks. Simple as that. You've also got things like specialized artillery or ammunition on your artillery. The Iron Thunder system, for example. Not only does it give you an increase in range at a hefty increase in price, but it makes all 23 of your artillery rounds into laser-guided artillery rounds. You will see here on the Ranger's Sniper, they have something called a laser designator. Laser designators interact with smart munitions. Anything that has this little laser designator icon on it. Once a weapon with a laser designator is fired at a target being actively lased, that weapon will home in directly onto the target, making them incredibly powerful theoretically. But you are, of course, paying a premium cost for that ammunition, and you are also reducing your availability of other weapons, like having smoke shells, for example. You will also have things like cluster warheads and simple high explosives, and then also ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles, as the name indicates, are missiles that go straight the fuck up and then straight the heck back down again at very, very high speed. They are very accurate, as you can see, an accuracy of 10 meters, and they do a heck of a lot of damage to top armor, mind you, as well. As in in Broken Arrow, you have front, sides, rear, and top armor, with several weapons like the ballistic missiles, for example, or certain anti-tank weapons like the javelin being able to strike at top armor, making them significantly more dangerous. But any weapon that goes this far up, and also things like, for example, cruise missiles that can be mounted on the B2 Spirit, these are missile weaponry. Missile weaponry can be shot down by anti-air weapons. One of the coolest features in WARNO is how it expands upon the anti-air segment of things. In Broken Arrow. I'm going to make that mistake often, so bear with me. In WARNO, all you really need is one big piece of anti-air, which you'll place on the back line to hopefully shoot down some aircraft here and there, and one piece of close-range anti-air to deal with enemy helicopters. In Broken Arrow, the ideal defensive formation is multi-layered, where you might use things like PIVADs with their rapid-fire 20mm Vulcans and radar to shoot down not aircraft, but enemy missiles instead. This is a point defense system, whose primary duty is to protect things like the Patriot launchers. So the Patriot launchers can have up to a 16 missile battery, which is massive overkill in 90% of circumstances, but they too have radar and a lot of range. That range is important because if you activate the radar system, it doubles, meaning that your Patriot missile battery will have 6.4 kilometers range against enemy aircraft. That's a lot. That is a whole heaping heck of a lot. But, of course, that means that your system will be vulnerable to enemy seed operations, as seed exists in this game as well, and it locks onto active radar systems, meaning that you might need some PIVADs around your Patriots. Then, your front line will be things like the Linebacker, SHORAD, short-range anti-air defense systems, which might have things like Stingers for dealing with enemy helicopters. Or you could upgrade it with the SHORAD system, giving it a 30mm cannon and, crucially, a radar, which will increase the range of the Stinger by 25%, giving it a 2.4 kilometers range instead. Very nice. Or even Hellfire missiles, which are, of course, dual purpose, capable of attacking both vehicles and aircraft and from the top, making the M6 SHORAD pretty damn dangerous. You've also got the usual mix of things like mortars, of course, tube artillery, and rocket artillery too, and then the aircraft. The aircraft in Broken Arrow benefit from having a far greater range of weapon systems. Everything from air-to-air missiles to long-range stand-up weapons to bombs, smart-guided bombs, or even semi-cruise missiles like the JSOW, or things like the Stormbreaker, or straight-up cruise missiles like the AGM, or nuclear weapons, tactical nukes, mind you. Now, they make a big boom, and if they hit anything, it's dead. It's dead in a rather large radius, but you are paying a premium for it as well. Oh, and by the way, you do have the ability to customize your units, which is really, really cute in my opinion. You've also got a stealth system, which means that some aircraft are far more difficult to detect. In the case of the F-22 Raptor and F-35A, this makes them really good at bombing missions. Sadly, the Nighthawk is still useless because it's too goddamn slow. Honestly, the Nighthawk needs to have its stealth, like, tripled. And even then, it's probably going to get shot down 90% of the time, but right now, it is garbage. Or you might bring in the Ghost Rider, the AC-130. It's really useful because it is huge, lumbering at a very easy target, but when it does work, it's really goddamn funny. And of course, the loadouts also go for things like aircraft as well. Honestly, the loadout system is absolutely brilliant, and I love it to death. So, some conclusions then. In the terms of deck builder, WARNO versus Broken Arrow. Which one has the better deck builder? I've got to give it to Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow's deck builder system, it's more flexible, in my opinion. It has way bigger variety in terms of the numbers of combinations you can have. And the benefit of the specialist system is that unlike WARNO, there I did it again. Unlike WARNO, which will which will ask you to pay for loads of divisions with only a handful of new units. In the case of Broken Arrow, you will get way more new units, and the varying specializations will be significantly more different. This does also mean a slower release schedule, mind you, as they've only announced 4 specializations, including a free one coming out soon for 2026. Meanwhile, WARNO is going to put out probably a dozen plus divisions in that same time. Furthermore, you will have to wait until 2027 for a new faction in Broken Arrow. However, the increased variety, along with the ability to customize loadout and the ability to pick all kinds of varied transport vehicles and the ability to transport multiple squads in a single transport, it is simply just a more flexible, larger scale system with more options and more value, frankly, for your money. So, as far as deck building is concerned, I gotta give it to Broken Arrow, hands down. But a deck builder alone does not a wargame make. So let us move on now to the gameplay. We are going to be focusing primarily on the multiplayer aspects of the game here, as I consider that to be the meat and the potatoes of the game, and also where the majority of the mechanics will become the most important. But before we get into it, let's address the single player offers as well, as there are a lot of people who still prefer to simply play these games in skirmish or single player. Beginning with WARNO. WARNO's main offering is the Army General Campaign system, where you will be put in charge of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact forces in a series of scenarios, ranging from very small, with only maybe 2 or 3 divisions, all the way up to hundreds of divisions. This game mode is divided into two different scenes. The Army General mode, where you can move your divisions around the map and call in reinforcement divisions, and the Tactical Battle mode, where you actually fight the battles on the field, just like you do in multiplayer. The Army General mode does also have a multiplayer component to it, which is very, very nice. And there is a fair bit of replayability here as well, as one of these campaigns can take a long time to play, with dozens upon dozens upon dozens of battles. Each one of these Army General campaigns also has a neat little introduction, giving you a brief overview of the history of the conflict. It also introduces a series of little PNG advisors to give you a little bit of story as you go along, but there's not a whole lot of storytelling being done here, as the focus is primarily on the strategic plane where you move your armies and the tactical battles where you wage the war itself. The main weakness of the Army General mode is the AI, which is just not very competent at all. Pretty much every tactical battle amounts to the enemy plonking down everything it can in the initial phase and then driving it all directly across the map straight towards you. It certainly puts on a hell of a lot of pressure initially, but once you survive what is basically a horde defense wave style mode, there's not a whole lot backing it up, as the AI is not really capable of much in the way of tactical or strategic brilliance here. Worse still, seeing as these are persistent units on the strategic layer, once the AI has managed to absolutely massacre an entire division on your defensive line, that's kind of all it's got. So most of the time, the AI will give you one hell of a fight for the first 5 to 10 minutes of a match, and then very little thereafter, which grows into a larger compounding problem on the strategic level as the AI simply exhausts its divisions one by one. The large-scale Army General campaign is a very neat idea, and I think with a bit more of a competent AI, it could be really great, but I've never quite managed to get into it myself. However, if you're the kind of guy who plays strategy games like these mainly for PvE skirmishes, then WARNO will offer that in absolute spades. Meanwhile, Broken Arrow has a linear and scripted real-time strategy campaign, where you've got two paths that you can pursue simultaneously in any order you choose, with an American campaign and a Russian campaign, which will introduce you to the various specializations in specific campaign scenarios, with a series of objectives that unlock as you complete them. It is far more traditional, and this has the strength of the AI being entirely pre-scripted, meaning that it remains a fairly consistent challenge throughout without the exhaustion problems of WARNO's system. It does, however, of course, also mean that once you've played a mission, you know exactly what is in that mission. And if you want to complete some of the tougher challenges, which are optional challenges for additional XP, which is used to unlock in-game skins, you need to complete some pretty harsh requirements. Some rather over-tuned requirements, in fact, if anything. The storyline here is more character-focused, as each campaign has a handful of characters that you will interact with over the course of the story. They are the ones who are giving you your mission briefings, and it is their drama that will, hopefully, encourage you to keep playing. As a self-contained campaign, as a story, the Broken Arrow one is definitely superior, as it, has a story, whereas the WARNO campaign is obviously focused on more of a dynamic style campaign. However, the Broken Arrow one will of course have significantly less replayability, because once you've played a mission, well, you've played it. But in many respects, the primary point of such a campaign is to introduce you to the multiplayer and to teach you how to play the game against people. In that respect, I do also believe that the Broken Arrow one does a better job of it, as it gives you scenarios that are more akin to those that you are likely to see in a multiplayer match. Your preference for which single-player game is superior will largely come down to whether or not you prefer to play dynamic skirmishes, or whether you prefer pre-made scenarios. If you like the former, then WARNO is your best bet. If you prefer the latter, then it's Broken Arrow. Let's get into the multiplayer side of things then, starting with how multiplayer matches work and how you win a match. Let us begin this time with Broken Arrow. In Broken Arrow, the map is divided into various capture zones. These capture zones can be claimed by any unit who enters them. However, a zone that already has enemy units inside of it cannot be claimed. And once a zone has been claimed for one team, the other team cannot claim that zone back until they've destroyed all enemy units inside of it, and then still have one of their units inside of the zone too. These zones obviously act as areas to focus the player's attention, primary capture points where the action is supposed to take place. Now, whether or not it does depends somewhat, because you see, holding the capture points in and of themselves do nothing. They don't increase your income, and they don't give you any specific bonuses. However, at the end of one of 3 equal-length phases over the course of a game, the team that holds a majority of capture zones will be able to gain victory points from it. The number of victory points earned depends upon the number of zones you hold compared to the enemy and the current phase of the battle. For example, if you are in the first phase and you hold one more zone than the enemy, then you will gain 1 point. If you're in the second stage, that's 2 points, and 3 points in the third stage. The more zones you own, you gain more points, up until a total of 3 extra points. That being 1 for the first phase, 2 for the second, and 3 for the last phase. Meaning that in the first phase, if you hold the majority of the objectives, you can get up to 3 points, and if you hold the overwhelming majority in the last phase, you can get up to 9 points. But this is not the only way to score those victory points. You also get them from destroying more enemy units than you are losing friendly units. Per team, you have a total amount of points killed and total amount of points lost. If you kill an enemy unit that costs 300 points, that's 300 points to your side. If they kill a unit of yours that's 100 points, that's 100 points to their side. If at the end of one of the 3 phases, you have killed 1,000 more points than the enemy has killed of your units, then you will be able to gain victory points through this system as well, in the same way as capture points. So, in the first phase, you will get 1 point per level with a total level of 3s, meaning a maximum of 3 points. And in the third phase, you will get 3 points per level with a total point value of 9. Furthermore, if one side captures all of the capture points on the map, then that side wins immediately. This system is a very intriguing deviation of the basic victory point system that we will look at in WARNO a little bit later on, and it has strengths and weaknesses. One of the strengths is that it rewards capturing objectives and killing units simultaneously, which in theory rewards both offensive and defensive play. The problem with the system is that because you don't gain anything in particular from holding zones, and because the points swing late game is so massive, with a potential 18 points at stake, enough to swing the entire game, To the point where even if you were losing the whole way through, you can still win in the final phase, which again has obvious advantages and disadvantages. It is certainly a comeback mechanism, no doubt about that, but the problem is also that it means that a lot of people will simply not fight for the first 2 phases, instead staying very defensive, focusing primarily on artillery or aircraft spam in order to try and kill enemy units, whilst not worrying about the objectives at all. And then in the final phase, in the last 1 to 2 minutes, bringing in transport aircraft to mass drop units on top of the capture points. If they've done this correctly, they will have an advantage already in terms of kills, and then, because you don't have a whole lot of time to react, they will either capture or neutralize a series of capture points as well, clinching the game in their favor. This is not a great system. I love the theory of it, and when it works, it does work very well, but it is far too vulnerable to a meta, seeing as the points actually don't matter at all. The capture zones are utterly worthless until the last moment of the phase, when the capture points are actually counted up and awards victory points. A far smarter way to do this would be to make the victory points themselves grant extra points that can be used to call in new troops, so as to actually encourage people to hold on to points so as to be able to call in more units. The lack of a mechanic like this is further exacerbated by the way that the game's economy works. So, every minute you will get a tick of resources that you can use to purchase more units. That's all fine and good. However, the tick is reduced by the number of units you have on the field. This is called the upkeep cost. So if you have lots of troops on the field, you will be gaining fewer resources per tick than your opponent does. This encourages people to use as few units as possible in order to save up for massive, huge late-game swells in order to capture those command zones. Yet again, rewarding a player for playing very, very passively with a minimum number of units and not engaging in any real attacking or offense. Now, the obvious counterplay to this is to launch your own attack to take advantage of the fact that the enemy does not have as many units on the field. But this is largely countered by the simple reality that it's a lot easier to defend than it is to attack. When Broken Arrow is played aggressively by both sides, it is probably one of the best and most satisfying wargames I've ever played. However, when played in the meta fashion like this, it gets very frustrating very quickly. Not just when you are fighting against it, but because you often have those people on your team as well. The player that simply abandons an entire flank and doesn't build anything in terms of an army solely so that he can save up for a last-minute nuke. Or even worse still, the person who doesn't deploy anything beyond a handful of artillery units, expecting you to hold the front line for him whilst he attempts to get as many kills as possible. And what makes it even more annoying is that sometimes that is actually a fully functional strategy, where if they can maximize their number of kills, you may get victory points for just that. Somebody who brings nothing but long-range anti-air, for example, hoping that the enemy will feed all of their valuable strike craft into his massive anti-air net, or a player that brings loads of artillery and simply focuses near exclusively on micromanaging it to get the most out of it. This is frustrating to play against, and it is frustrating to play with, as more often than not, you'll be the guy left forced to handle multiple opponents whilst the dude behind you sits on his ass. I appreciate the attempt to do something interesting with Broken Arrow's scoring system, and I do think it is still probably the best possible idea to reward both captures and kills, but the system does need tweaking. You do need to gain income from holding those points, or in some other way have a benefit for actually capturing them. Additionally, the late game point dump also needs adjustment, having the entire game be decided in literally the last 30 seconds. Whilst it does lead to some very close and interesting victories and defeat, it just does not feel very fair. Meanwhile, over in WARNO, we have both of these victory systems split up into two different game modes. Well, the first is destruction. Let's say that you destroy an enemy unit worth 200 points. You will then gain 200 points towards a limit that you've set before the game. Once that limit is reached, whichever team reaches it first wins. So say, for example, 10,000 points. The team that reaches that first wins the match. And depending upon how much more than the enemy they reach it by, like a 1,000-point advantage or a 100-point advantage, that determines the scale of the victory, from a major victory to a minor victory to a draw. It is nice, simple, and very tactical, as every single unit is of course worth its weight in victory points. It forces you to take very good care of your units whilst making sure that you engage the enemy in the best possible way. It can often lead to very slow gameplay, with both sides simply sitting, camping in a forest line somewhere, hoping that the other side will run out of patience first. And that feelings of impatience is heightened by the fact that whoever holds the most zones, whilst they don't get victory points, they do get more points than you, meaning more units and the ability to engage at even more favorable odds later on to win the destruction race. The other mode is Conquest, where you have, again, the capture zones on the map. Unlike in Broken Arrow, every capture point you own will give you a constant amount of ticking income, which is the reason why you capture them, in addition to, of course, the victory points. If you hold a majority of the points on the map, you will gain victory points consistently. Whoever reaches a set number of victory points first, say for example 1,000, wins the game, with the same kind of gradient as with destruction. If you win by 100 points, that's a minor victory. If you win by 200 points, it's a major victory, and so on. It is a very simple game mode, and it is a very satisfying game mode that forces you to go on the offensive to capture the points, and then lets you defend them against the enemy's attempt to reclaim them. At the end of the day, I do believe that Broken Arrow's system is theoretically superior. It will require a lot more tweaking and balancing and little adjustments to really hit that actual promised potential, whereas WARNO's system, although simpler, has perfected its formula and is therefore, at the moment, the better system. It should also be mentioned here at the tail end that WARNO also has a game mode that Broken Arrow does not. A very interesting game mode called 10 vs 10. Now, 10v10 battles are never going to be truly balanced for the obvious reasons of the numbers of people involved and the potential deck combinations you've got. However, it is really fun to simply play these enormous battles, and I wish and hope that Broken Arrow might do something similar. However, there is a bit of a drawback to this as well, as we've got to now mention player count. WARNO is about 1 year older than Broken Arrow, so do take that into consideration, but WARNO tends to have only about 1/3, or even as bad as 1/4, of the active players of Broken Arrow, so finding a game can be significantly harder in WARNO than in Broken Arrow. Let's move on then from the general gameplay to something a bit more granular, as we are going to talk about how the main branches of the army fights: infantry, armored, air, and artillery, as these are supposed, of course, to operate in very different ways and do very different things. And both of the games do attempt to illustrate this in its own ways. Let us begin with infantry. The key difference between how WARNO and Broken Arrow treat their infantry is in the degrees of success that they can achieve, and the degrees of failure as well. In WARNO, for example, if you've got infantry inside of a forest or inside of an urban environment, they will absolutely trash most armored vehicles with casual ease, as they can fire their anti-tank launchers from very close range without being spotted by the tanks. However, if the infantry is called out in anything but a dense urban environment or a forest, they are little more than 3 kills in 99.9% of scenarios. This means that in WARNO, infantry exists near solely either inside of densely urban areas or in forests. The densely urban areas are divided into 2 things. One is small urban populations with tons of villages, where a group of houses will usually make up a block that the unit can enter into. Combat within these areas are usually short and brutal, with specialized units using satchel charges or flamethrowers absolutely dominating other infantry, but they very rarely, if ever, carry anti-tank weaponry, forcing you to use both types of units and specialities to truly take control of an urban environment. Then there are those cities with larger built-up things like skyscrapers. These are far more interesting because you now have multiple levels of engagement, where smaller squads will fight closer to the ground, with overwatch weaponry like snipers or grenade launchers or heavy machine guns providing supporting fire. Unfortunately, there's only 1 or 2 maps in WARNO that really makes full use of this type of urban combat, which is tragic because it is genuinely very good and very interesting, and finally gives infantry a real place to fight, where they can shine as the stars rather than as merely just the supporting actors. In Broken Arrow, infantry is a lot less dramatically effective, but a lot more effective again overall, as even if you've got an anti-tank rocket launcher in a built-up environment, if the tank has an active protection system, it will shoot down that rocket, the same as it will any anti-tank guided missile, allowing certain armored vehicles to wander into villages or forests without really having to worry over much about the infantry. Up until a point, of course. That active protection system will only shoot down the first rocket, and if the infantry is carrying 3 rocket launchers, well, the following 2 will certainly put the hurt on the tank. But whereas the infantry in Broken Arrow is not as dramatically effective in very specific circumstances, they have more general utility. For example, scouts can laser target enemy vehicles or installations to be hit by guided ordnance from aircraft or artillery. Snipers are not just spotters, they can also be excellent ways of shifting enemy units out of their own defensive positions, like buildings, for example. And whilst infantry in Broken Arrow is no more effective than WARNO infantry out in the open against armored vehicles, they do have the advantage of having far more interesting urban centers to play in, with a lot more elevation and larger rooms between the buildings, allowing for far more interplay between support weapons, anti-tank guided missile launchers, and the infantry weapons themselves, like dedicated marksman's rifles, sniper rifles, automatic grenade launchers carried within the squads themselves, and a wide variety of small arms too. And on top of that, infantry in Broken Arrow can also use tools like smoke and sprint as well. Infantry combat in Broken Arrow feels a lot more dynamic and impactful, and infantry feels significantly more powerful overall and flexible. They are a key part of your deck that can be utilized for huge portions of the map, rather than being, like in WARNO, sort of pigeonholed into specific areas, because not being in those areas equals death. And as an even bigger bonus, of course, Broken Arrow's ability for you to select your transport vehicle, from aircraft to helicopters to a wide variety of IFVs and APCs, they're also just a lot more flexible and fun to play with on top. So for infantry combat, the victor has to be Broken Arrow. What about the tanks then? Armored vehicles, the biggest, often most expensive, and coolest pieces of kit on the battlefield. And where the infantry was a fairly clear-cut winner, the armor is a lot more complicated. In WARNO, armor has a very specific role. It fights in open terrain. Much like how infantry is supposed to confine themselves to urban territory and forests, tanks do really poorly in those kinds of terrain. And so they fight out in the open, in the largest, flattest, least obstructed areas you can find, where their heavy armor allows them to soak up damage, and their powerful main weapons allow them to destroy the enemy. This leads to very intense and interesting micro-battle engagements, where it's all about controlling your armored units, pushing them forward when you think they have the advantage, retreating them when they're damaged, smoking at the correct time, and or finding nice ways to approach the enemy for flanking attacks. It's, in a way, simplistic, but it's also very, very fun, and really gives that feel of massed armored combat. WARNO also has the advantage of having a lot more tanks and different fun versions of tanks to play with. Because it is set in the 80s with a lot of 70s and 60s and even 50s gears as well, you have many generations of tanks to choose from. Everything from T-55s to T-80s and highly modernized T-72s. Everything from M60s, Chieftains, Challengers, Abrams, etc. You've even got loads of specialized fun little tanks like flamethrowers or giant plapping 152mm howitzer tanks. And due to WARNO having a lot more countries than Broken Arrow, you also get to play with very interesting mechanics and differences between the various factions. German heavy armor plays significantly different than Russian heavy armor. American heavy armor relies a lot on mobility and being able to fire on the move, whereas French heavy armor usually has terrible protection but often come with autocannons and rapid firing guns. Meanwhile, the Soviet tanks have usually got excellent protection and decent aim, but terrible mobility, or more correctly accuracy when on the move, but they also often come with anti-tank guided missiles that can be fired from the weapon's main barrel, giving them significantly longer range than pretty much all of the NATO equivalents. You even have funny little things like a series of French tanks, for example, that carry racks of ATGMs on top of the barrel. The gameplay too is usually a lot more rewarding over successes. If you manage with your heavy tanks to knock out the enemy's prized heavy tank, that is a huge advantage for your side that can quickly spiral into a significant advantage on the entire side of the battlefield where you manage to carry out this victory. Whereas in Broken Arrow, of course, if you destroy the enemy's prized armored vehicle, it will come back. And in general, the maps in WARNO are simply just more focused on armored gameplay than most of the maps in Broken Arrow. Meanwhile, in Broken Arrow, armor is in an interesting little place at the moment. Initially, it was heading towards a bit of a super heavy meta, a la the same lines as in WARNO, where the heavy tanks are absolutely dominant and can usually beat up an equivalent amount of points in medium tanks with contemptuous ease. To start with, it was somewhat the same in Broken Arrow, with T-14s and fully upgraded Sep Abrams dueling across the battlefield. But with more and more of a focus on laser-guided projectiles and airstrikes, the heavy tanks began to disappear more and more from WARNO. Until now, the truly heavy monsters are a rarity indeed, simply because they are a lot easier to counter in Broken Arrow. As if you throw a cluster bomber aircraft at it, it's likely to kill the tank. And even if you lose the aircraft, the tank is often so expensive, it's a one-to-one trade. And even if you fail to kill the tank, you will have pushed it off the battlefield for a significant amount of time whilst it's being repaired. Additionally, infantry in Broken Arrow is a fair bit more powerful and a fair bit more of a threat in many situations in many more areas. Whereas in WARNO, you only really need to fear enemy infantry in urban environments or forests. In Broken Arrow, there can be anti-tank guided missile launchers sitting in any number of houses or small hamlets, or ATGM launching vehicles in patches of woods, or even laser-guided artillery projectiles dumping 152mm rounds directly on your head, or zooming in enemy aircrafts or drones, or any dozen other threats. Tanks are simply not as dominant in Broken Arrow because there are a lot more toys that can counteract them. Simultaneously, however, tanks are also far more predictable in Broken Arrow. In WARNO, when one tank shoots at another, there is all kinds of opportunities for critical hits or damage to internal components. Most of the time, you're not going to see an Abram be blown up in one shot by near anything, unlike a medium tank being hit by a heavy, for example. But the anti-tank guided missile launchers fired against it have a random % chance to hit or miss, as does all of the other weapons too. In Broken Arrow, with things like active protection systems and multiple smoke charges, your tanks feel significantly more survivable in a predictable fashion. You know that single ATGM is not a threat. You will simply shoot it down with your active protection system. 4 missiles, that's a threat. Now you need to smoke. And of course, this also gives you rewards and risks. Do you pull your tank back after it's depleted all of its active protection charges? Or do you push forward, assuming that the enemy is running low on ammunition as well? In general, Broken Arrow's tank combat feels a lot more like you are actively engaging with the game. Whereas in WARNO, it often feels as if you are a little bit at the mercy of the RNG number generator. This is also why in WARNO you almost always only bring the heavier tanks, because their survivability is more easily predictable and measured. Whereas in Broken Arrow, medium tanks now have massive usage areas where they can engage enemy IFVs, ATGMs, and all kinds of ground targets with significantly less risk of losing an incredibly high value vehicle than if you were to use one of your prized heavy tanks. In conclusion then, this is a tough one, but I think WARNO comes out just ahead of Broken Arrow in this one. Broken Arrow has greater predictability and in many ways more mechanics as well, like active protection systems. And I do love the tank battles when they get going, but WARNO has more tanks, and it's more specifically oriented against tanks and having you use them in the areas and the environments they're supposed to operate in. Whereas in Broken Arrow, the tanks don't feel quite as impactful in most cases. Which leads us neatly to air power. Because if you rule the sky, you rule the ground, or at least that is the theory. And in many cases, it's also certainly true. Let us begin with Broken Arrow then, because Broken Arrow has put a lot of effort into its air combat. Aircraft have a multitude of defensive measures they can employ, such as coming in at differing altitudes from low to high. They have ECM and they have flares as well. They even have functional stealth aircraft, which don't really function in WARNO. You technically have some stealth aircraft there as well, but they're not very good. Whereas in Broken Arrow, they can be absolutely devastating. And if you need to get out of a bad position quickly, you've also got afterburners as well. But you don't just have defensive measures, you also have a huge number of offensive measures as well, which can be shown specifically in the different kind of missions you can give to your aircraft. For example, you've got the simple strafing run, where your aircraft dives down and fires its cannons into an area. And any fire and forget weaponry, like Mavericks for example, will lock on to any enemy tanks or vehicles that it can detect in a large area surrounding the strafe target and fire those off as well. You can also order the aircraft to carry out bombing runs over significant areas. You can carry out long bombing runs where you drop the load over a huge area, or short ones where you try to dump all of the bombs onto a specific target. And if that's not accurate enough for you, you can also use laser-guided ordnance, where if you've got somebody with a laser designator lasering the target, you can drop a 2,000-pound bomb directly on top of a target. And there are very few things that survive a 2,000-pound bomb deployed straight to its roof. And of course, on top of that, you've also got seed missiles that home in on radar signatures in an effort to try and destroy enemy anti-air systems. And obviously, you have anti-air weaponry as well. Everything from short-range infrareds that can strike both aircraft and helicopters, to long-range anti-air missiles like AMRAAMs, to even standoff weaponry with ranges in excess of 9 kilometers. And the planes aren't the only things in the air either, as you've also got things like drones. Something that WARNO only has, I think, a single drone for one specific deck. These drones can be used as highly effective scouts, able to survey a huge amount of the battlefield. They can also, of course, be used to deliver weapons onto the enemy, thermobaric bombs or ATGMs as well, from cheap and easily expendable packages. The Air Force in Broken Arrow is one of those tools that if you know just how to use it, it can be absolutely devastating. But it's also a tool that can actually straight up lose you entire games as well. If you start using it carelessly, simply throwing your valuable aircraft away, you're going to be handing a lot of kill points to the enemy with relatively little effort, as anti-air is pretty damn effective in Broken Arrow. This makes it so that you'll want to use things like stealth aircraft, or have complex approaches where you need to queue up a lot of orders to get to a target. This has upsides and downsides. The upside is that you can do it. You can carry out a very high-level bombing run. But the downside is, to do it, you've got to queue up something like 7 different orders for the perfect bombing run, which is a lot to ask of the average player, particularly in a game that doesn't have much of a tutorial in this regard. And of course, you've also got helicopters. The helicopters in Broken Arrow are leagues better than the ones in WARNO. The WARNO helicopters, they don't have anything technically wrong with them in that how their weapon systems works. The problem is their movement. Helicopters in WARNO tilt maximum rotor first forward to reach the highest possible speed, no matter the distance it needs to travel. Then, once it reaches its target, it needs to pull all the way back in a massive maneuver to slow down and then slowly come back into a hover and then aim and then fire. By the time the helicopter has done all of this, it's probably been shot down 3 times over by, well, people with rifles at that point. Whereas in Broken Arrow, helicopters are very intelligent when it comes to their maneuvers. None of that rapid acceleration and deceleration. It will move towards the target at a hover, able to deploy its weaponry immediately. It's even good enough to the point where you can pass it through a couple of skyscrapers, and through the tiny gap between the two of them, the helicopter will snap off opportunity shots at any targets that presents itself. On the WARNO side of things, air, it's nowhere near as developed. Air, most of the time in WARNO, tends to be do-or-die platforms that you send in to kill a high-value target, like an enemy heavy tank, for example. Or occasionally you might have an aircraft capable of flinging its bombs and then getting out of there. The 101st Airborne, for example, has a unique electronic warfare aircraft, which is something that Broken Arrow doesn't have, by the way, but there's only one of them in WARNO, so... This is a really interesting aircraft that I would like to see a lot more of in both games, because you need to pay an extra premium to call it in, of course, 100 odd points, but it makes your strike aircraft significantly safer, encouraging you to carry out operations with mixed aircraft types, defensive and offensive mixed up together. But besides this interesting little point, the WARNO aircrafts just don't have as many cool things. They don't have as many cool weapon systems or as many interesting defensive abilities. They don't have laser-guided ordnance. They don't have the ability to designate a particular area to be struck, or the concentration of bombs to be placed in that area, all at once or in a long line. The seed mechanics in Broken Arrow are also a lot better, as you have to deal with multi-layered enemy air defenses, shooting down both missiles and aircraft, anything and everything from man-pads all the way up to Patriot missile batteries. And as I already complained about, the helicopters, there's simply no comparison between the two. The Broken Arrow ones are vastly superior. If there is one mechanic that Broken Arrow could really use with stealing from WARNO, it is the automation of some of these things. For example, in Broken Arrow, if you've got an aircraft on the field, it does not automatically retreat if it's low on fuel, which can be a little bit of an annoying micromanagement task. And there's no reason why, like in WARNO, you couldn't simply just order an aircraft to be, okay, when you're about to run out of fuel, just retreat. This isn't that much of a big issue with aircraft, as you'll see a nice big fuel gauge on screen, but with certain drones, for one reason or another, they don't show those icons, meaning that you've got to constantly go and check on the drone and see how much fuel it's got left, or simply resign yourself to the fact that it'll go dumping into the ocean at some point. So this category goes very clearly to Broken Arrow. Leaving us with the fourth and final category, support/artillery. Now, I'm sure we all know and share the nightmare of the support player. You know the guy, the one that doesn't build any frontline units, but sure brings a lot of artillery, which, once it's all out of ammunition, will start moving suspiciously towards your supply dumps. It is an eternal problem in virtually all wargames. And the differences between Broken Arrow and WARNO in this regard are unfortunately not as strident as I would have liked. Honestly, I'm at the point where I would like to see artillery simply just bloody removed from these games, but here we are. Let us begin this time with WARNO. WARNO has a very interesting set of mechanics for artillery. which is automation. In WARNO, cannons can be given 3 different orders. One is simply fire at will, where they will fire at any targets that present themselves inside of their spotting range and inside of their firing range. So if one of your recon units on the other side of the map sees an enemy, and your cannon has the range to shoot it, it will start to do so. This is an interesting little thing, as you can create automated support areas where you have cannons of a certain range bombarding certain areas of the field automatically. Obviously, it's not going to be as effective as guiding them onto the target yourself, but it does give you more of an opportunity to micromanage your front lines instead. The other option is defensive fire, where you designate a small circular area, and anytime an enemy unit is spotted moving into that area, your batteries will open fire on it. This too is very nice for creating predetermined kill zones. And the most interesting, counter battery fire. I love this ability because it goes some way to, well, helping to deal with enemy artillery. And I've even had some success in creating dreaded support decks around this focus, where you have a battery of stationary but very long-range artillery sitting at the rear of your own map, focusing solely on counter-battery activities, making it very dangerous and risky for the enemy to use their artillery, or at the very least punishing them if they ever get lazy. Now, obviously, the simple counter move to that is to give your artillery a fire move, and then immediately followed by a shift-clicked move order after their fire mission. But the increased time to fire and salvo lengths means that counter-battery fire in WARNO can actually be rather dangerous. If anything, I would like to see this ability massively buffed, to the point where your artillery batteries can use observation and telemetry to figure out the positions of enemy artillery batteries in an area, and then counter battery fire more effectively, so as to make it far more difficult to use artillery effectively if someone else is willing to dedicate their artillery to countering yours. Perhaps even some sort of suppression effect that makes the aim time of your batteries significantly higher. These systems are not present in Broken Arrow, which I really do think is a shame, because the counter-battering in particular I view as a genuinely excellent opportunity to begin clamping down on artillery spamming, which is a well-known cancer in both the games. Beyond that, artillery in WARNO can be divided into several different classes. Towed artillery, which are the good old-fashioned massive traditional guns, which usually have longer range for their calibers and are available in some pretty heavy-duty calibers too, 152mm and upwards, etc. Then you have mobile artillery, or self-propelled artillery, which has a little bit of armor and of course the ability to move more quickly than towed artillery. And then you have things like mortars and multiple launch rocket batteries of varying lengths, sizes and ranges. The primary purpose of artillery is, of course, to both kill the enemy and also to cover your own forces, utilizing specialized ammunition like smoke, for example. In WARNO, all of this is done fairly well, if also very, very standard. Things like rocket launchers, like the Katyusha, is done to saturation bombard an area, often not to kill what's in there, but to suppress them to the point where they will be unable to fight your advancing units. Things like napalm will make buildings uninhabitable for an extended period, allowing your own troops to close in on them without taking fire. Meanwhile, massive artillery batteries like 200mm and 152mm are used to try and kill and snipe out enemy vehicles, or infantry, or indeed even dedicated to counter battery. You do now have an intriguing little system in WARNO where you can set up a multi-layered artillery system with some heavy guns in the rear dedicated to counter battery, some medium-ranged guns on the middle line ranges, which are simply firing at anything that comes towards them or defending an objective with defensive fire, and then some smaller artillery guns like mortars up front helping your infantry deal with specific targets of enemy infantry that are entrenched in urban centers. The problem is, however, that due to the investment required to make this work, you're not going to have a whole lot of points for anything else, which leads yet again to the unfortunate reintroduction of that godforsaken artillery spam. But support isn't just artillery, it's also things like anti-air batteries as well. WARNO's anti-air system is very simple. A unit will have two different ranges, one against aircraft and one against helicopters. Any target that enters that range can be fired upon by the launcher. The launchers are either radar or infrared. The only real difference is range and whether or not they can be targeted by SEED, which only target radar batteries. Other than that, AI is pretty straightforward, which is in sharp contrast to Broken Arrow, which we'll talk about now. In Broken Arrow, the artillery does much the same, but with a far lesser degree of automation, which I do wish they'd introduce the automation to Broken Arrow as well, especially the counter battery. You have the same types of general guns, although you don't have towed artillery in Broken Arrow, which sort of makes sense because of the sheer scale of the maps. If you were to use towed artillery there, it would become a sitting duck awfully quickly. Beyond that, you have the regular mortars, some tube artillery, and rocket batteries as well. You also, however, have smart munition, which, if you've got a sniper or a scout with a laser designator, can allow certain forms of ammunition to guide itself in on the target, guaranteeing very close or direct hits, giving a little bit of extra mechanics to the support play. Where the differences really shine is in the anti-air field. In Broken Arrow, you can shoot down incoming missiles, even SEED missiles as well. And so the perfect aerial defense net will have SHORADs up front, short-range anti-air defenses, which will accompany your advancing forces and vehicles to protect them specifically against things like helicopters or very, very aggressive aircraft. Behind that, you might have a middle line of direct fire anti-air weapons, things like shilkas, for example. These are intended primarily to be relatively cheap and try to shoot down incoming enemy missiles to defend the long-range AA, the AAA batteries, whose purpose it is to use their extremely long-range anti-air weapons to deal with enemy aircraft and bombers. You can also use heavier mid-range anti-air using missiles to shoot down other missiles. This is usually more effective, but also comes at a significantly higher investment. This makes the AA net very, very interesting. Unfortunately, however, once an AI missile is fired, it leaves behind an enormous pillar of smoke as well, which means that the artillery can try to counter battery it and destroy it. Now, on the one hand, it rewards Micro with additional, fire missions and looking for enemy trails and trying to deal with the enemy's anti-air batteries that way. And it also rewards the Micro on the Defender by seeing when a battery is fired and then moving it manually. But again, it feels odd to have that be such a focus when counter battery is far more difficult than counter air is. And honestly, well, artillery shouldn't really be used to destroy anti-air guns. That, if anything, should be the duty of things like SEED systems. So personally, I would have preferred if you'd simply removed the smoke entirely, made it very difficult to see where these missiles were fired from, unless you had a spotter within a certain range, so that you had to rely primarily on SEED to, well, suppress enemy air defenses, rather than on your artillery to do it instead. these private annoyances aside, which one is the best system? This one is quite difficult. In terms of anti-air, I absolutely give it to Broken Arrow, no questions. But in terms of artillery, WARNO has a far greater selection of artillery pieces that can be used in a far more interesting and different types of ways, and they feel more like tools rather than the be-all and end-all weapons that they all too often feel like in Broken Arrow. So on this one, I kind of have to go both. Broken Arrow's anti-air system is vastly superior to WARNO, but WARNO's artillery system is way better than Broken Arrow, so a draw. Ease of learning. Now, this topic goes beyond simply chasing and figuring out the meta, managing to make an effective division, and playing well on the battlefield. It has more to do with how easy it is to get into the game and start playing. Bearing in mind that both of these titles are fairly high-level war games, with a lot of mechanics and a lot of nuances to set them apart from a more traditional real-time strategy experience. With that being said, WARNO immediately has some massive advantages over Broken Arrow. The first and foremost being the fact that it has a replay system, where you can load up your multiplayer matches and see exactly what you did right, what you did wrong, and what the enemy did right and wrong as well. Wargames like these are as much about understanding your enemy's perception of the battlefield as it is about understanding your own view of the battlefield. In the realest sense imaginable, information is power in both WARNO and in Broken Arrow. And with a replay system, you can see exactly why your assault failed. Was it simply not supported enough? Maybe you needed to bring up more anti-air. Maybe you needed some more artillery. Perhaps a quick burst of smoke shells would have stopped that anti-tank guided missile unit in the tree line from engaging your tanks. Or maybe the enemy simply had a cleverly disguised ambush waiting for you. Other things might be like, how was your artillery destroyed? Well, you see, the enemy placed a very sneaky scout unit in a super clever position right behind you, and that's how they saw you. Now, not only do you know about that position for future usage or counters, but you might easily learn a thing or two from your enemy as well. Feels like you're playing against a deck that's just blatantly overpowered? Well, load up the replay and see what weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and strengths that your enemy had and didn't have. Broken Arrow does not have a replay system. This was a particularly massive mistake, in my opinion, on behalf of the developers, because learning a game like this without being able to go back and see what happened is awful. Really, really awful. As again, in a game where information is power, only having access to half of the picture is almost worse than not having access to any of it. This problem was further exacerbated as well by another baffling decision, namely to release Broken Arrow without any sort of inbuilt anti-cheat system. That was not a very good idea, as things like map hacks, universal visibility, infinite units, and let me tell you, you have not played a strategy game like this until you see a single unit of infantry fire off 5,000 rockets in a cluster so thick it looks like a ginormous shotgun shell. cheating was rampant, insanely so, for several months after release. And this, in addition to not having replays, built up a system of distrust amongst the player base, where they didn't know anymore if their units were being spotted because of a cleverly hidden sniper or because of the enemy was simply cheating. This also led to a very hostile community, as this too is an aspect of learning the game. In WARNO, you are relatively likely to run into crass, but otherwise decent people willing to talk about the game, how it's going, strategies, and so on. The various Reddits and fan forums are excellent sources for advice and deck building presets, whereas in Broken Arrow, oh boy, it has some of the most hostile forums I think I have ever seen. And a lot of this is due to the fact that, again, due to not having a replay system, frustration builds up more and more. Without access to perfect information, everybody has to assume the reasons why they lost, how they got spotted, why that unit was destroyed, why their strategy didn't work. It places them in a situation where, first and foremost, they want to protect their own egos, as is only natural and human. Launching the game without a replay system was an enormous blunder. The developers themselves have recognized this and are working on implementing a replay system. And their excuses for not doing so was, well, quite simply, they didn't have the time or resources. And, well, I sympathize, but it does mean that the game is a lot more difficult to learn than WARNO. On the flip side, Broken Arrow's campaign does do a better job of introducing you to the units that you are going to be commanding in multiplayer. And if you finish the entire single-player campaign first, you will have been taught a fair few tips and tricks on how to handle your units and how to engage certain enemy units as well. In stark contrast to WARNO's campaign, which doesn't really teach you anything other than, well, try to survive the bum rush. And due to the fact that the AI there plays nothing like a player ever would, it also doesn't really teach you a whole lot playing against the AI either. But despite these shortcomings, the replay system is simply too powerful of a tool for learning. It makes all the difference. And so WARNO, in addition to having the replay system and having fewer and more easy to get to grips with mechanics overall, is definitely the easier game to learn. DLC and long-term support. In this day and age, if you want to get into a game, it is important to know whether or not the devs will continue to support that game, both with new content and continuous free updates and refinements to the game overall. In this case, honestly, both WARNO and Broken Arrow have done a very good job of actively responding to community feedback, although with varying degrees of success on occasion. Broken Arrow's developers can certainly learn a thing or two from WARNO when it comes to not antagonizing their community quite as much. But on the flip side, Broken Arrow, which released in a state that, whilst the gameplay was excellent and mechanically complete, it didn't have the bells and whistles necessary around it. It didn't have an anti-cheat system. Big mistake. It didn't have replay. Still doesn't. Huge mistake. It didn't even have a save game system for the single-player campaign, so you better have 40 minutes to an hour to finish that match, or you're gonna start all over again. It was a rough state to launch the game in, but the developers have since dedicated all of their time on fixing these various issues, and have gone quite some way to fixing them as well, as they are currently working on save games and replays, which are major upcoming features in 2026. And whilst they've been focusing on this, they have not been putting out any DLC, and they've announced that the first piece of DLC will be free. So, initial hurdles and stumbling stones aside, I do think the developers are genuinely trying to do right by their community here. Meanwhile, WARNO has a far better pedigree when it comes to its developers' long-term skill and expertise within this particular genre. Eugene Systems has released a lot of games like this, and their game was pretty much perfect from the beginning onwards. Mechanically complete save games, replays, skirmishes, army commander mode, everything you could possibly desire was in right at the start. And so they have focused most of their time on two separate things. One is DLC, with about 9 packs of varying sizes having been released so far over the course of about a year and a half. These DLC packs are, as I mentioned in the deck builder segment, I do believe that they are a little bit small for what they should be, as in most cases these DLCs are released at a cost of between $5 for the smaller ones up to $20 for the larger ones and about $10 or so for the middling ones. They usually include at least 2 new divisions with 2 or 3 or 4 new units and maybe a new mechanic here and there. And the larger packs, such as for example the South Hag pack, included a total of 2 new Army General campaigns and 10 new divisions, in addition to, again, some brand new units and a little bit of additional voice acting for the new nationalities. These packs are usually received with mixed reviews on Steam, as most people do not believe this is great value for money, and I would agree with them on that. It's not a fantastic business model, and I much preferred the older systems in Wargame, where they released a lot more units and a lot more unique units in their packs. But it is absolutely a sign of continued support for the game. The other primary area of focus for the developers have simply been to refine the overall gameplay. Again, Eugene has been doing this stuff for quite a long time, and they've gone through a lot of different iterations on the core gameplay loop of the Wargame series. But they are still experimenting. WARNO itself is a far faster game than pretty much all of their preceding Wargames, and they are currently experimenting with that increased pace. They are currently working on, for example, an artillery rework, as they are beginning to retool pieces of the game to be more realistic and more fun. All of that is, of course, absolutely great, and I have no doubt that WARNO will continue to receive a lot of support and updates going forward. In Broken Arrow, meanwhile, there is one piece of upcoming free DLC which will be out soon, quotation marks, in addition to 2 other pieces of DLC over the course of 2026. In grand total, these 3 DLC packs will introduce 4 new decks or specializations for the factions, with 2 of them being for the US and 2 of them being for Russia. Meanwhile, the primary focus of the game will be to continue to add in and refine mechanics in the base game, including loitering ammunition and co-op campaigns, as well as spectator modes and the crucial replay system. And then in 2027, they've also announced another pack of specializations and a brand new faction to be added to the game, in addition to new biomes and theaters of war, which will of course also come with their very own campaign as well. It's a little sparser than WARNO, to be sure, but let's face it, the Broken Arrow developers also have a lot more things to clean up in their own house before they start monetizing their product, so I think it's a fair and balanced long-term strategy. It shows that the developers are still absolutely committed to the product, and also that they understand the errors that they have made, so I think it too is a pretty damn good supporting strategy. Overall, again, this one's rather difficult. On the one hand, Broken Arrow simply needs to fix a bunch of mistakes that it made initially, and it is going to offer a bit of a sparser DLC strategy initially, but the DLC in and of itself is likely to be far more meaty and substantial on an individual pack-by-pack basis. Meanwhile, WARNO doesn't have to spend as much time refixing, reinforcing, and changing their core gameplay loop, so they can focus a bit more time on DLC. But whereas they offer more DLC, it's not of the greatest quality. So yet again, I'm forced to call this one as well a draw. Modding. This is of course where one of the big long-term prospects of the game comes into view, as a solid set of modding tools can extend the life cycles of these games way beyond their natural shelf life, and potentially give you, well, multiple games for the price of one. A brilliant example of this is the Galactic Divide mod for WARNO, a full conversion mod, or pretty close anyways, that introduces Star Wars units into WARNO, including brand new features such as capital ships bombarding the battlefield from above. It also has a 40k mod as well, although it's a little basic at the moment. There is very clearly a lot of potential here in WARNO's modding scene, and if these mods are allowed to continue to prosper and grow, boy, it could be really great. Already in its very early phases, the Star Wars mod, for example, is a lot of fun. And frankly, it plays like the game was made to be this way. If Eugene Systems aren't seriously considering making a science fiction game their next wargame, then they are woefully asleep. Meanwhile, Broken Arrow, whilst it does have modding support, and it does have a few mods at the moment, the modding tools are very limited, and will probably remain very limited for a pretty damn long time, as again, the developers are busy fixing the main game, rather than working on larger scale modding tools. However, that is not an indicator of future promise, obviously. One interesting example of this is that the developers put out an April's Fool's mode to the game, a zombie defense mode, which is a lot of fun, and it's a really cool concept, indicating that the developers are already toying around with tools on the back end to make fun and engaging little side projects, or allow people to make them themselves, as a World War Z style scenario in a modern war game. Not only could that be a really fun asynchronous multiplayer, it could be one hell of a cool story system as well. Right at this moment though, there is absolutely no doubt WARNO has by far the superior modding scene, with by far the larger and more ambitious mods. Hopefully Broken Arrow will catch up though, as I never realized how much I wanted a science fiction war game until just recently. Let us talk then about matchmaking. This is, of course, something that is very difficult to truly quantify, as, of course, the limited numbers of players, the high skill ceiling, and the wide disparity between players' abilities will mean that a truly fair fight will be a rarity regardless how good your matchmaker is. But there are some points that can and should be noted on. WARNO's matchmaker is a fairly standard system that uses an ELO rating to find your opponent, where you can choose your side before the game begins. Although, honestly, the majority of people simply use the lobby system to find opponents. This means that the matchmaker itself is often simply bypassed, and if you're jumping into a random lobby with a random bunch of people without any skill scores being shown, well, a balanced match is neither expected nor realistically feasible. Although that being said, I have found that the majority of WARNO matches have been fairly close, with the blowout being fairly few and far between. And I will be speaking purely from my own experiences here, mind you, because any and all experience with these matchmakers will be highly subjective and based upon your own experiences with it. In ranked games as well, WARNO feels fairly balanced as far as matchmaking goes, with the complete blowout being rare, although they have happened. I have seen ELO spreads up to several hundred points, which is fairly significant in WARNO. However, if you're simply having fun playing the 10v10 game mode, for example, then obviously none of this really matters. And in a way, the game's relatively small player base is a blessing in disguise here, as those who are still playing tend to be at more or less the same skill level. Meanwhile, in Broken Arrow, oh boy, Broken Arrow's matchmaker has some problems. I have seen ELO spreads up to 800 points. And with a maximum ceiling and spread of 3,000 to 4,000 points, that is a big deal, and essentially places you in a match that you have no business being in. Now, with that being said, I have found that the majority of Broken Arrow's matches are also quite close, and indeed a fair few of those matches have turned on a razor's edge, being won or lost by individual points, or 2 or 3 at most. And due to a plentiful number of combat mechanics, it is rarely truly and absolutely over. However, there is a big caveat to this, and that is that Broken Arrow unfortunately has a bit of a culture of stacks. Now, let me preface this, of course, by pointing out that if you're going to play highly competitive, complex war games like these, your best bet is to find 4 other people to play with, no doubt about it. But basic logic yet again dictates that if you're going to have a matchmaker, do not put full stacks up against random players, because that is one of the easiest ways to get people truly and thoroughly frustrated with your video game, as in these cases the ELO differences are exacerbated by a huge degree. And the developers themselves also encourage this behavior by hosting 50 team rooms on their server, encouraging people to create full stacks to play the game. On the one hand, this is a good thing from a community building perspective, but it makes playing the game itself, just for fun, solo ranked, into a truly awful experience at times, where you can see the enemy team literally on the Discord full stack playing against randos. The lack of a stack versus stack matchmaking mechanic is simply yet another in a very long line of serious oversights that the Broken Arrow developers have made during the creation of this game. And worse still, it yet further adds to the frustration that people are feeling when they are playing the game. Not only can't they load up a replay to analyze what their opponents did wrong and or incorrectly, they also have to deal with the very likely scenario that they're up against 5 people, organized over voice, with no mechanic to filter those out of you simply sitting down and trying to have a match. This is absolute poison to the casual player. And so, whilst bearing in mind that this is a highly subjective and personally experience-based decision, and that it can change at any time as matchmakers are updated frequently as well, in combination with the game's overall balance, etc., I've got to give this one to WARNO. If only for the simple fact that it has frustrated me significantly less than Broken Arrow has. And there you have it, in great and autistic detail. Which is the better wargame, Broken Arrow or WARNO? Let's summarize. Deck building, Broken Arrow. Victory conditions, WARNO. Gameplay, infantry, Broken Arrow. Armor, WARNO. Air, Broken Arrow. Artillery, a draw. Ease of learning, WARNO. DLC, another draw, at least for the moment. Modding, WARNO. Matchmaker, WARNO. That makes it 3 categories won for Broken Arrow and 5 to WARNO. Although that does not tell the full story. Again, these are both excellent titles, highly complex and interesting wargames. And which one you should choose depends really upon your preferences for the various categories, and whether or not you are a veteran of wargames already. If you've already played several of the previous entries in Eugene's Wargame series, then Broken Arrow is overall going to have more for you to sink your teeth into. More mechanics, and an overall more complex and interesting gameplay, rather than the far more arcadey feel of WARNO. However, if you are a newbie to the wargaming genre, if this is to be your first wargame, then there really is no doubt WARNO is the far better casual experience. And so whilst I would personally champion Broken Arrow as the better of the two, because I've played all the previous wargames, and in many ways WARNO, whilst I really do appreciate the faster pace compared to previous wargaming titles, there's just something a little off. Like they increased the pace without quite managing to let the gameplay keep up with it. Meanwhile, Broken Arrow's mechanics I absolutely adore. Mechanically, again, I think it is the vastly superior wargame, but man, I have never experienced anywhere near as much frustration in WARNO as I have in Broken Arrow. Now all that remains is to lean back and wait for the next Steam sales. Or, if you happened across this video at an actually relevant time, congratulations. And I hope this video has been of some use. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.